Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm really excited for this. I was here in January of this year and was blown away. I will say I don't think I'm ever going to match the grandeur and splendor of this room for a talk. This is a far cry from my classroom at the University of Central Arkansas. Um, Now, as I mentioned, I was here in January and I got to meet a lot of great folks at the Society of Cincinnati, and I've got to meet even more of you tonight. And I'm excited to meet as many of you out here tonight who took your time to come as I can at the reception. I want to thank the prize committee. This was a very competitive year for books on the American Revolution. With the 250th anniversary coming up, the American Revolution is really having a moment. And I think it should have always had this moment, but I'm really excited to be a part of this moment and to share with you some of my research. Now, I mentioned also that I was here in January. I want to thank Andrew for inviting me out in January. He's great. And because I was here in January, I can't give the exact same talk I gave in January. I gave my official book talk in January. So tonight what I'm going to be doing is reflecting and projecting. So that's why this one, my title tonight, is Under and Beyond Alien Skies. So I'm going to be reflecting tonight on my experience writing this book, why I wrote the book, what generally the book is about, and how I went about organizing and researching and analyzing it. But I'm also going to project out some other avenues that I think are especially exciting, innovative, and I think where environmental histories of the American Revolution might go. Because the fact of the matter is, this is really the first totally environmentally focused book on the American Revolution. When I started doing research for this book, it surprised me that it was. There are a lot of award-winning books on the American Civil War from an environmental perspective, World War I, World War II, but not the American Revolution. So I want to start off with thinking about a question. Now, this is kind of a question you see in sports a lot. Did the Kansas City Chiefs lose the game, or did the Philadelphia Eagles win it? And it's kind of an infuriating question, but it gets the pundits what they need, and there's plenty of conversation that goes on. And I think this is kind of where we are at the American Revolution in some ways right now, too. Did the British lose the war, or did the Americans win it? Now, just from a few book titles here, you can see that there's no real consensus necessarily. O'Shaughnessy's The Men Who Lost America. Furling's The American Revolution and the War That Won It. Duval's Independence Lost. Weddell's The Complete Victory. And then finally my own Environment, Suffering, and the Defeat of the British Military in Revolutionary America. But beyond just kind of this infuriating in some ways question, I think this really gets us to this idea of perspective and perception. How perspective and perception are everything. Not just in our modern world, but also in how we view the past. Well, for me, as I was doing the research on this book and writing it, and then in finishing it, I've realized how much my own perspective and perception has indeed shaped how and why I wrote this book. Oftentimes, I really know why I write a book from the beginning. It starts with a question. Now, the simplest reason on that was there weren't any histories of the American Revolution from an environmental perspective. Now, a big reason I wrote this book is because I went to graduate school at the University of Kansas. When I was there, it was a real hotbed of environmental history. Dr. Donald Worster, who is the creator of American environmental history, was one of my professors, and all my graduate students were environmental historians. I was kind of the black sheep. I was the colonial Americanist, but they were always trying to draw me into their ranks, and they finally did. Now, which I'm very happy that they did. I will also say that for my first job, I moved to Arkansas, and I grew up in a little farm town in western Kansas. Any tree in my town basically was planted. It's its own kind of beauty, but it's very flat, windy, open skies. And when my wife and I moved to Arkansas, I kind of felt like an outsider. I wasn't used to driving on highways and not being able to see where I was going because of trees everywhere. We would go on hikes, and we would, we bushwhack up to waterfalls, and we've gone through rivers where we're almost getting swept away. Not the smartest thing we've ever done, but we made it where, where I lost a hat. We climb up mountains. And so I think that as I was reading these German and British soldiers' accounts, I could kind of empathize with them because I felt the same way in going in this new environment. But also, and I only realized this when I finished the book, I was a sophomore when 9/11 happened. And a lot of the kids, the older kids from my high school, went to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when they would come back, we'd ask them, well, what was it like? And they wouldn't talk about their human enemies as much as they'd talk about the environments that they were going into. Vast deserts, sandstorms, camel spiders, heat. And I think that was in the back of my mind this whole time, and I didn't even realize it, because these British and German soldiers who came over, sailed 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to fight in the Revolution, were doing the same thing that these young kids from Kansas were, and going thousands of miles east to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're an invading army. They had all these perceptions of the environment. And the environment was a huge enemy for them. Now, also, don't just take my word for it. The people living during the time were saying the same thing. So I argue in Under Alien Skies that the American Revolutionary War, when you take it from a British and a German perspective, was a war of and against the American environment. Roughly 50,000 British and 30,000 Hessian soldiers sailed across the Atlantic to fight in the American Revolution, and around half that many camp followers, women, children, servants. This was one of the largest invasions of America up to this point. Actually, it was the most people who'd come to America in a short period of time up to this point. So they're kind of rediscovering America in this way. Now, this is a perfect example, an opportunity to see what they think about this new world. And from the moment they arrive, they don't feel very good about it. And we'll see that in this talk today. But the colonists who see them coming are saying that they don't belong here, not just as a military invading force, but literally their European bodies and minds don't belong here. Muhlenberg, a British German, but American colonist, called the British and German soldiers a kind of seed that may not be very well suited to this American soil. Now, the Germans and the British themselves feel the same way. Schopf, who was a surgeon for the Hessian army, he spent 4 years at this point in America trying to nurse men back to health. And he finally admits in 1780, he says, maybe those westerly gales, fogs, and mighty seas, which Columbus battled to reach the New World, were actually cast in the way of Europeans by a beneficent providence as so many warnings to keep off. That maybe Europeans were never supposed to come here in the first place. His experiences in America had taught him as much. Now, in Under Alien Skies, I uncover this in, 6 chapters. Now, I kind of bring the two E's, I think, that this study really contributes to the our knowledge on the American Revolution. One, of course, is environment, but the other one's emotion. This is a very emotional history of the American Revolution. To read these men's diaries and letters, they're spilling their guts. They're very sad. They're very upset. They're experiencing homesickness, anxiety, depression. They're worrying a lot. And it really shows, and recent works on the American Revolution have done this, it really shows that these men weren't just chess pieces to be pushed around. They're the boots on the ground, and they were struggling to survive not just the next battle, but the next day, the next week. A lot of this was monotonous. They weren't fighting most of the time, but they were fighting different enemies. Now, something else it does is I bring them over on the ships. And the American are kind of memory of the Revolution, and for, quite frankly, American soldiers and civilians at the time, the British and the Germans only matter when they arrive in America. There's a famous line from a colonist who said that when he saw these transport ships arriving in the New York harbor, it was as if all of London was afloat. Here's the thing. By the time they, quote, matter or arrive in America, they've already been at sea for months. Now, these were young men who not only never fired a gun in anger, but who probably had never been out in the open sea. Suddenly, they're crammed onto these horrible transport ships. And on the way over, they're experiencing the American environment for the first time. It's kind of a seasoning experience for them. They're seeing icebergs for the first time that tower over their ship. They're seeing islands with volcanoes, sharks. They're experiencing hellish sea storms that absolutely terrify them, waves the size of mountains. They're experiencing horrors, men throwing themselves overboard to commit suicide, other men falling from the masts and, this is gruesome, but exploding in front of them on the deck. So by the time they arrive in America, they feel like they've already been at war with the natural world, which they feel like the Atlantic Ocean is part of America's natural world, and they're kind of already losing it. Now, the next chapter looks at physical terrains, how they are experiencing. The example I'd love to give is imagine you're a kid who's grown up in London, young man, and now suddenly you find yourself trudging through a waist-deep swamp in South Carolina with dead-eyed apex predators like alligators. You've never seen an alligator before. Mosquitoes everywhere, it's dark. Or maybe going in an old-growth forest for the first time. They often feel suffocated by these forests. Mountain ranges like they've never seen before, vast lakes, rivers, the list goes on. Chapter 3 looks at flora and fauna, how especially strange animals are constantly weirding them out. They're really scared of the rattlesnake. They've heard all these rumors that the rattlesnake can hypnotize its prey, including humans, and then attack it. There's rumors of this snake called the hoop snake, which doesn't exist, but it can put its tail in its mouth and it rolls at you, which would be pretty terrifying. They don't come in across any of those. They're constantly, though, also complaining about mosquitoes, chiggers. They're terrified of snakes. The eventual Lord Admiral Nelson, as a young man, is tasked with invading the Mosquito Coast in modern-day South America. As he and his men, they've never seen a rainforest before. As they're invading it, his men are getting attacked by big cats. They're seeing iguanas for the first time. He gets deathly ill and has to go back to London. He never really is the same after this. Now, chapter 4 looks at climate, weather, and disease. Modern parlance combined the three. The three were intertwined. In fact, according to modern science, changing from one climate to the other, if they're different, could not only destroy your mind, but your body. It could change actually who you were. So these men really worried about going to this new world because they thought that the climate there could actually change their very key constitution. Now, they're also experiencing all these new weather events. Incredible cold in the north, of course, and incredible heat in the south. But no matter where they go, they think that it's extreme. In New York City, for instance, they note that they'll have an incredibly hot day followed by an incredibly cold night. They experience these same things at sea, and they think those kind of weather changes can really hurt you. At one point, when they're stationed in New York City, a horrible thunderstorm descends upon the city, and it blows up a military munition ship on the East River. It shatters every window in New York City on the east side, knocking people to the ground. They're experiencing earthquakes for the first time, massive floods, forest fires, all kinds of different weather events, and they're getting sick a lot. More men in the American Revolution die of illness than they do bullets. So they're dysentery, yellow fever, smallpox, malaria, especially in the South. And this chapter 2, I look at different regions. They're especially horrified of the southern region they call the torrid zone. My wife and I love to go to St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, for vacation. They hated the Caribbean. They were not happy going down there. It's a very modern idea of splendor. Chapter 5 does something new. It looks at mental illness. So it looks at how these soldiers are struggling with anxiety and depression, which we would now call, which they called at the time some melancholy, homesickness, which they called nostalgia, and then some were committing suicide, which they called self-murder at the time because you were actually murdering yourself and it had legal ramifications for your remaining family members. Chapter 6 finally follows them back home. Once again, from the American perspective, once America wins, the British and the German soldiers go away. Well, for them, the war wasn't over. They had to get back home. They had to sail back across the Atlantic, which was a shorter trip, but still wasn't any kind of pleasure cruise. And when they got home, they were struggling a lot, struggling with what we would now call PTSD. They're also, of course, they've lost the war, so society doesn't view them the same. In their pension rolls, as they're trying to roll off, the British soldiers, as they're trying to get out of the military, oftentimes a reason that's listed is just worn out. Now, I would argue that this is a mental thing as much as a physical for them. Some of them go home and say that their friends don't even recognize them anymore. Some go home and say that they don't really know how to reinsert themselves in the society. It also looks at the different lessons that the British military and the German military learned under alien skies. Now, that's a general outline of the book I wrote. Today, I want to kind of think about the American perspective of this war. Because time and again, the question I get is, well, what about America? How did these American soldiers experience this war? And I always say, that's a great question. That would be a great book that someone else could write. I thought about including the American perspective more in my book originally because I have a ton of research on it. But as I was writing my perspectives for my proposal for the book, I realized I'm kind of shoehorning this in. This isn't the story I want to tell right now. But I do want to approach it today. And I want to think about this idea we have today still of this America being linked with its natural superiority. America does, of every country, we have the most diverse ecosystems, the most of them of any nation in the world, even more than China. We have everything. And we link still to this day, the proverbial we, a lot to our land, our natural resources, and our variety. Now, that wasn't a good thing according to European parlance in the mid-18th century. In fact, European philosophers like Buffon here were deriding America. Buffon said that America exists in a desert and melancholy state, which will never produce anything but humid creatures, plants, reptiles, and insects, and cold men and feeble animals are all that it will ever nurture. He's arguing that everything there is smaller, it's inferior, all the creatures and animals, than the people, the Native Americans. Well, a lot of times in this story, okay, enter Thomas Jefferson, who after the American Revolution is really trying to come after Buffon. In fact, while he's in France in 1786, he's asking friends to send him over specimens. He wants them to spend, eventually he's going to find mastodon specimens, and he wants those to be sent over. But here he's saying, the readiness with which you undertook to endeavor to get for me the skin, the skeleton, and the horns of the moose, the caribou, and the original or elk emboldens me to renew my application to you for those objects, which would be an acquisition here more precious than you can imagine. He wants to show the Europeans, you're wrong. We have all these big animals too. We're not inferior. Now, oftentimes this is where people kind of start this conversation, but I think that it begins way earlier. I would go back to what I call World War Zero, the French and Indian War. It is the first world war in human history starts over land in the Ohio Valley region. A 22-year-old George Washington, you might have heard of him, starts it. Now, I think World War Zero is really clever. I think it would be a good book title. If you guys have like an idea of like an argument I could make around that title, I'd appreciate it. But this was, in fact, the first World War, and it starts over land in America. And I don't think that's you know, a coincidence. Now, as the British and the French are fighting over this land in America, the British suffer a horrible defeat. General Braddock tries to march into the back country in the Ohio country in Fort Duquesne. He's unprepared, and he's surrounded and defeated. This is an image of his men invading, and you notice that they're just surrounded by trees. One of his soldiers who was there describes it as 110 miles of uninhabited wilderness over steep rocky mountains and almost impassable morasses. Now, at the same time, American colonists start linking their own identity with their land. A Bostonian writes the Newcastle Weekly Courant after the defeat. This is and always will be the consequence of Old England officers and soldiers being sent to America. They have neither skill nor courage for this method of fighting. They stand no chance. Remember my words, I do affirm that if they send over 20,000 men from Britain, they will only fall sacrifice to the enemy in this case being largely the environment. Now, little did he know that they're about to send 4 times that many people over to fight in the American Revolution. But he was on to something with the environmental woes they were going to face. Now, the British, though, do win the French and Indian War, which actually helps lead to the American Revolution. In 1763, they try to limit colonist expansion west with something called the Proclamation Line. Okay? Many colonists, including George Washington, want to go to war because of land, because of the environment. So I would argue that by the time the American Revolution breaks out, this is a war over the American environment and identity related to that American environment. I argue that if you want to argue that America did indeed win the war, that the British didn't lose it, I would argue that it was despite and because of the American environment. So another kind of frustrating thing. Okay, I'm not really coming down on anything. Now, some of this idea of their relation with the land was literal. Okay? They literally wanted to own this land, and they were using the land to assert their natural rights, independence, liberty, self-governance. You also, though, have a lot of figurative connections to the American environment. Their natural superiority. So what they start to argue is, you know what? You all have been saying that the American environment's this bad place that produces inferior creatures. You're wrong. Our American environment isn't the problem. You're the problem. It's Europeans who are the problem. Our American environment has made us stronger, more wealthy, better in basically every way. Now, and so this gives them this kind of more distinct American identity. So what I would argue is to understand this American identity, whatever that means, Americans really start to craft it around the environment. So once again, don't take my word for it. Let's look at the South Carolina's first seal. This is the front on the left and the rear on the right. Now, when it came out, the South Carolina explained why they chose what they chose. The palmetto furnishes food for man and affords him a more secure defense against an enemy than stone wall. Now, side note, there's an excellent Revolutionary Museum display in there, and you'll see Sullivan's Island. At the Battle of Sullivan's Island in South Carolina, they used the palmetto tree for the walls of the fort. The palmetto tree is extremely spongy and strong, so it repelled the British cannonballs. Okay, so they saw it as this naturally superior thing. So, superior to the British oak, it defies the British Navy. In this country, it first proved its worth in a manner that constitutes the most famous tree in America, and it's native to our soil. The fallen tree is the oak and emblem of England. Its position alludes to the state of her authority with respect to the lopped branches denoted that her colonies are separated from her. Now, on the reverse side, you have hope advancing over a rock, which is rugged and steep behind her, but smooth and gentle ascent before her. She holds a laurel flower in her right hand and has a view of the sun rising in full splendor. She holds a laurel flower in her hand because a flower is not only a natural ornament for her, but it is a native to our state and an emblem of success, victory, and their attendant safety, present objects of hope. By seeing her on a rock, we remember that our hope is well-founded and that her having passed a rugged and steep ascent is an allusion to the great difficulties we have surmounted by having pressed forward to our natural objects with hope as the smooth and gentle ascent before her. Now, they keep going. And they finally say that the sun rising in full splendor alludes to the rising glory of American general in this day in particular. But they're very, intentional about what they choose here. You have the palmetto tree, the fallen oak, the laurel flower, the rocky ascent, and of course the sun. They're using not just South Carolina's native plants and features, but also America's to assert themselves as distinct and superior to the British. Now, they see this play out in some other ways as well. Famously, George Washington gets himself trapped at the south tip of Manhattan Island in August 1776. This is a low point for George Washington. His officers actually say that he was kind of almost quasi-suicidal because right off the bat, he's gotten himself trapped and he's about to lose his whole force. This could have been the end of the war. Luckily, though, on August 29, 1776, a providential fog rolls in that gives his men cover to escape. Many of his men link this actually to another providential, in this case, storm in 1588 that helped England defeat the Spanish Armada. Americans feel like nature is on their side. And they also feel like it always has been, though, and this is this crowning moment for this. A writer to the Boston Gazette in February 1777 says, "Such are the eminent advantages with which heaven hath favored us, that if we do our duty, there cannot remain a doubt of our success. Look round the world, and you cannot find a country like this. Nature has been lavish in her bounties to America, as if the New World was to surpass the Old, and the glory of human nature was to receive the highest perfection near the setting sun." Another writer of the Providence Gazette in 1779 says, "This country seems to have been peculiarly, if I can say that word, favored by heaven, in many respects to that of Canaan of old. Born for independence and happiness, America produces all the necessaries and most of the luxuries of life. Her resources for warlike and naval stores are within herself unbounded and inexhaustible, which together with a great variety of other staple commodities from every part of the continent will always furnish ample materials for commerce with every part of the world." So going into the war, Americans are seeing the environment not only as on their side, but as they themselves. They are linked with it and they are superior. Now, that's propaganda and publicity, of course. It's easy to write that in newspapers. Tell that to the soldiers who are struggling, fighting. As we're going to look at, it's not as if bridges appeared over rivers for American troops, or mountains were squashed, or winters were warmer for them. You have Ben Franklin admitting as much. 1777, Lee remarks that Dr. Franklin told me the manner in which the whole of this business was conducted was such a miracle in human affairs. Armies of offense and defense were formed and kept the field through all the rigors of winter in the most rigorous climate. Joseph Plum Martin, a young Continental soldier, is very clear in his feelings about the American environment and his experiences in the Army. At one point, he says, "Here I endured hardships sufficient to kill half a dozen horses while stationed in Fort Mifflin, starving and freezing." Once again, though, America also had the propaganda machine on its side during the Revolution. The press was running, and it was pushing a narrative of natural superiority and natural victory. Now, I want to use this time to kind of go through the American experience through the outline I noted with Under Alien Skies. Now, remember, most young men who fought in the American Revolution were from rural backgrounds. Only about 5% of colonists lived in cities, and had never been more than 50 miles from home. So if you're a kid from Boston and all of a sudden now you have to go down to South Carolina or something, that's going to be a big shock to you. Well, here's a quote from one of these people who are experiencing these shocks of, quote, coming over from the American perspective. They say, "We've been also assiduous in business in this exhausting, debilitating climate, that our lives are more exposed than they would be in camp." Okay, so this is kind of scary. This poor person's had to go to some new debilitating climate, destroying them, and they almost wished, that they'd be better off in a camp than here. Well, who could this be? Well, it's no other than John Adams, who has gone from Boston to Philadelphia in 1775 for Continental Congress. Now, that's a 300 miles south. But, as you see here, John is complaining to Abigail as if he's in a whole different climate. Now, remember, perspective is everything. This is a big part of Under Alien Skies. It's about as much as British and German soldiers' perspective and their perceptions of the American environment as it is about hard realities. So he's holed up in Philadelphia with Second Continental Congress, and he's worried that this debilitating climate in Philadelphia is going to destroy him. And he said he'd be better off at camp in the military than he would be here, which, okay, I don't know about that, John. But his correspondence with Abigail continues. About a month or a few days later, Abigail said, she replies, "At last I hear what I have long expected and feared for some time. I was certain that your nerves must be new braced and your constitution new molded to continue well through such a load of business, such intense application, in such a climate through the burning heats of the summer is too much for a constitution of steel and ought not to be required." About a year later, she says, "I fear that," he's still there, "I fear the extreme heat of the season and the different temperament of the climate and the continual application of business will finish a constitution like yours, so naturally feeble." Yep, she's always very worried about him. About a month later, she says, she's in Boston. "We've had a turn of extreme hot weather when we could neither work or sleep. If I suffered so much here in Boston, what I often think must you in that climate in Philadelphia. The hot weather here, is of short duration and generally succeeded by a cold storm or an easterly breeze, which soon revives our languid spirits." So this is someone going from Boston to Philadelphia. Imagine and he's not at war. He's enjoying 3 square meals a day. Now, he's doing hard work, but not exactly dodging cannonballs and soldiers. And this is his experience. For these other soldiers, they are experiencing these same things, but on a much heightened level. Now, what about terrains, flora and fauna? Well, many of the physical terrains would have been new to American soldiers as well. Once again, I give this swamp example. They're going into new areas, new mountains, new rivers. They're having, like I said, it's not like they suddenly don't have to wade through a river. The bridges don't appear for them. The winters, the swamps are still hard to get through. They don't have magical roads that appear. Some of them, they understand the swamps better. Francis Marion infamously uses the swamps to his own advantage. But they're fighting these same physical terrains. Most of them haven't necessarily experienced alligators or haven't had a lot of run-ins with rattlesnakes. The mosquitoes attack them just as much as well. So they're really up against this a lot. someone who I'm going to mention more later, a graduate student right now named Blake McGreedy, is investigating this in his dissertation, The American Perspective of the War, and they're up against much of this as well. Now, what about climate, weather, and disease? Now, they do have some natural advantages with disease. For instance, Southerners are more seasoned to the different fevers that are common in the putrid season down there in the spring. But that doesn't help a lot of the soldiers. General Greene writes in 1782, while he's stationed in South Carolina, the Army, notwithstanding our activity and the supposed unhealthiness of the situation, have enjoyed an uncommon share of health. So he's saying, okay, we're in this bad situation, but we've been doing okay. Now, they're still not doing okay often, though. So, for instance, George Washington has to inoculate his troops for smallpox in 1777, a very controversial choice. He resisted as long as he could, but he had no choice. Dysentery and malaria are ravaging his troops. More troops die from disease than do bullets or battle. They're dealing with infections. And as we'll see in the future, they're also not just dealing with physical diseases. They're struggling with mental health issues as well. Now, remember, climate and weather were intertwined with disease. It's not just Adams. Adams were kind of at the tip of the iceberg. Men who are actually at camp were indeed being ravaged by the changes of climate, the weather patterns, and all sorts of disease. A couple more quotes. Jefferson says in 1780, "Were it not that an invasion of our state at Portsmouth shuts the only door of our commerce, I had rather fight our share of them here than send 300 miles to seek them in a climate more fatal than their sword," being the South. So the South is a climate more fatal than the enemy's sword. Horatio Gates in 1780 sends to Samuel Huntington, "Major Armstrong, the deputy adjutant general in the Southern Department, having early in the campaign, by the unwholesomeness of the climate, contracted a violent fever, which terminated in an intermittent fever, and had reduced him to a skeleton. He has my permission, in order to save his life, to go northward. I desire Congress will please to indulge him and with a leave of absence until his health is restored." Soldiers are suffering from heat stroke. They're freezing to death in their tents, swamp foot. The list goes on. Now, an especially illuminating, we'll say, example, we're going to go back to New York City in August 1776. Now, Washington has tons of troops stationed there because he knows the British are coming, and he knows that that's where what they're going to come for first after Boston. In late August, a horrible thunderstorm strikes the city. Schaukerk, who was a priest there, described it as this: "A very heavy thunderstorm came on. It lasted for several hours till after 10 o'clock. An uncommon lightning, one hard clap after the other. Heavy rain mixed at times with a storm like a hurricane. The inhabitants can hardly remember such a tempest. Upon the whole, it was an awful scene." Time and again during the American Revolution, British and German soldiers are going to say that the local inhabitants have never seen a storm like this. They've never seen a winter like this. They've never seen a summer like this. They do indeed have the coldest winter on record up to that point in 1779 and 80. The Pennsylvania Journal explained further, "Many houses were damaged and several lives lost. 3 officers, a captain, and 2 lieutenants belonging to Colonel McDougall's regiment were struck instantly dead. The points of their swords for several inches were melted, with a few silver dollars they had in their pockets. The persons were seemingly roasted. A dog," and this is sad, I'm more sad about this, "a dog in the same tent was also killed, and a soldier near it was struck blind, deaf, and dumb. One in the main street was killed, as likewise 10 on Long Island. 2 or 3 were much burnt and greatly hurt. When God speaks, who can but fear?" Now here's the thing. Remember those men with their melted swords? Okay. Well, a patriot tells a loyalist named Wells, Susanna Wells, that, quote, "The poor unenlightened Yankees believed that they could use makeshift lightning rods to ride out the storm. Some glimmering of the science of electricity having beamed on them from their great Dr. Franklin," Wells contended, "they actually stuck the swords in on the tops of some of their tents by way of conductors and went to rest, thinking themselves in perfect safety, when lo, the faithless steel brought more quick down heaven's wrath." So some of these soldiers thought that they could make their own lightning rods. They stuck their swords on the top of their tents. They didn't understand what they were doing, allegedly. And these, of course, were conductors, and that's how those men were killed. Now, this is an interesting twist, of course, and in this case, it seems as if nature is against them. That when God speaks, who can but fear? The faithless steel brought more quick down heaven's wrath. It's also showing, though, that nature doesn't choose. that you have this interesting paradox here where Americans are asserting themselves as naturally superior. They're using propaganda. They are indeed, they do have some advantages where they know the terrain better, local supply networks, et cetera, but they're still struggling. A lightning strike doesn't pick between a British and an American soldier. Now, finally, we get to mental illness. George Washington's constantly struggling with his men and training these troops, but he's also oftentimes worried about them mentally. As he says upon taking over the army, men just dragged from the tender scenes of domestic life, unaccustomed to the din of arms, are timid and ready to fly from their own shadows. He talks about how this sudden change of manner of living brings impatience and all, and such an unconquerable desire of returning to their respective homes that it not only produces shameful desertions among themselves, but infuses the like spirit into others. Like the British and German soldiers, these men were anxious, they were homesick, they were depressed. And for them, unlike British and German soldiers who were 3,000 miles away from home, sometimes they were fighting a battle 30 miles from home. An American surgeon, Waldo, says, "I am sick, discontented, and out of humor. I can't endure it. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze? What sweet felicities have I left at home, all agreeable, all harmonious. Here all confusion, a pox on my bad luck." John Adams worries, coming back to him, in 1782, "The English malady is upon us." The English were especially well known at this time for committing suicide, so much so that a guy named Chain wrote a book called The English Malady about suicide. "The disposition of suicide, which destroys so many individuals among us, has seized the Americans." American soldiers are regularly committing suicide by all means. To read their diaries, they're also depressed, they're also anxious, and they're homesick. Mental illness is striking their ranks just as hard often as it's striking the British ranks, but for some different reasons. But the environment definitely plays into this. Now, this brings us to the next piece, going home. After the war, American soldiers didn't have to travel 3,000 miles home, but they brought their experiences with them. Now, I've analyzed federal pension claims between 1792 and 1795. Of the 573 pension claims from veterans, 100 of them, or 17%, are directly linked to environmental inflictions that they endured during the American Revolution. Now, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 1778 is famous for being so hot that men are dying on the field and dropping from heat stroke. It didn't just affect the British and the Germans, though. Some examples. Asa Bruce contracted a disability while in service, being overheated on a march on the day of the Battle of Monmouth. Gilbert, his constitution being impaired, being overheated, Monmouth. Barnes, overcome by the extreme heat and fatigue at the battle, which occasioned weakness. Kent, injured his constitutions because of Monmouth, incapacitated by fatigue and heat, injured by great exertions. You can see this guy suffers elliptic fits, being overcome with heat and fatigue at the Battle of Monmouth. Now, it wasn't just the Battle of Monmouth. Amos Snow said that he was deaf and just worn out in service. So he didn't say it was the environment. That's reflecting, though, the British soldiers I told you about. Hebron, he was hurt by the branch of a crooked tree on the brink of the Hudson River on his passage from West Point to Dobbs Ferry in New York, which branch struck the eye of said Hebron, after which he lost sight thereof and became blind. So that's very literal. A tree branch poked his eye out. But Scudder lost 2 fingers in the use of both of his hands by being frozen in a snowstorm. Obert, disabled in his health and constitution, which in some measure affected his use of his limbs in 1776 by the smallpox and colds in Canada. Finally, Morse was afflicted with a nervous inflammatory disorder, which deprived him for some time of the use of his reason, and which has ever since totally incapacitated him for labor, in consequence of wading a river encumbered with floating ice in obedience to his commanding officer. As I mentioned, these men are going up against these same hardships and these environmental woes, and many of them are suffering the consequences for the rest of their lives. Now, despite that, coming out of the war, Americans really hit this propaganda campaign hard. They are flying high. As the Pennsylvania Gazette publishes in 1783, the citizens of America are placed in the most enviable condition as the sole lords and proprietors of a vast tract of continent, comprehending all the various soils and climates of the world and abounding with all the necessaries of life. America seems to be peculiarly designated by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. They've just beat the most powerful military force in the world, and they're saying that now is their time. Americans and their environment are superior. Well, the problem is, and this is another question I get, well, how does the War of 1812 fit into this? As I always say, we didn't manage to win the War of 1812 in so much as we managed not to lose it. As they agree in February 17th, 1850 with the treaty, they're going to go back to status quo antebellum. So let's just pretend like this didn't happen, okay? Now, 16 to 20,000 of Britain's roughly 58,000 troops that they send over arrive in North America from across the Atlantic, and like the British soldiers before, had never been to America. So they're re-experiencing a lot of this. But they have more knowledge of the American environment now and what to expect because of the men who've been before them and the fact that the British have had troops stationed in Canada this whole time. Now, as we know, they come to New York, or Washington, D.C., and they burn it to the ground, mostly in August 1814. But Providence, nature, has a hand to play once again, because as Washington, D.C. is burning, a tornado hits the city, and it really puts out a lot of the fires. The British soldier Gleig recalls, of the prodigious force of the wind, it is impossible for you to form any conception. Roofs of houses were torn off by it and whisked into the air like sheets of paper, while the rain which accompanied it resembled the rushing of a mighty cataract rather than the dropping of a shower. It had the most appalling effect I had ever, or probably shall ever, witness. I wish I would have found an account of a tornado in the American Revolution. I found hurricanes and earthquakes, but also, once again, Americans use this as an example of the providence of the natural world saving them again, just like it had with Washington in 1776. Here's the problem, though. I would argue that coming out of the War of 1812, America kind of has an identity crisis. They want to go back to their natural superiority. This is a reason that someone like Andrew Jackson rises to power. He's reviving, of course, the Jeffersonian myth. He's all about land and expansion, just like Jefferson had been. Land, land, land. I would argue that to understand manifest destiny and westward expansion, we have to understand this as Americans still reckoning with something that they'd been pushing since the French and Indian War. American identity is inherently connected to the environment and land, and that is still going on to this day. Now, before I go to questions, I just want some more reflections and projections here. Some place that I think environmental histories of the American Revolution might go. One is the hard sciences. Like I said, my book's a lot more about perceptions of the American Revolution. David Chung is working, he's written a couple articles on the topic where he's looking for his eventual book project on more kind of hard analysis of the scientific effects on the American Revolution. He's measuring soil where battles took place to see how much lead was deposited in the soil and if that affected future growth of plants and things. Blake McGreedy, who I mentioned, has looked at how the environment affected specific battles in some articles, and right now he's doing a dissertation on how the environment figured into the American Revolution in New York State. I think looking more at Native American experiences in the Revolution could be really interesting. I had a section in my book originally that was looking at how British and German soldiers categorized Native American peoples right alongside the New World animals. They described them the same way, but readers recommended I took it out. I still kind of wish I could have kept it in, honestly, but I think that beyond just Native Americans dealing with like pathogens, disease, and different American policies, how are they using their knowledge of the environment to help figure into this war? And there's some interesting work being done on that already. A guy named Nelson just came out with a book about the Great Lakes region. I'd also like to know more about the other invaders, French soldiers. Something I include the French, I talk about them a little bit in my book, but they weren't here as long. There were only about 15,000, I think, French soldiers who come over, or a little bit more than that. A lot of them don't like the American environment very much either by the time they're leaving. But it's different when you've won. But I'd like to see some more on that. The last really big book that was written on the French experience specifically in the American Revolution was Scots from York Turn to Balmy in 1998. So I think we're really, kind of take the same approach that Bauer took with the Hessians, but take the French approach and then look at their environmental experiences. I think there's a lot more work to be done in the War of 1812 and how the environment played into that, which I've just touched on. And then I think there's a ton more work to be done on mental health and emotional history. The history of emotions is really experiencing an uptick right now, but they almost always skip over the American Revolution, especially from soldiers' perspectives. And I think they're especially an interesting group for what they were going through, what they're experiencing, and how the environment played into that. So I really appreciate you guys' time tonight. I hope I've opened up some ideas for some great questions, some interesting avenues, and I'm happy to answer any questions from you all.